this is the Red Bull model of, we're going to bring you in, we're going to wash you off, clean you up, and we're only going to put you on the roster if you are podiuming over and over again. As soon as you stop performing, you're out. So I feel like that model is slowly being retired because it's really hard to connect to as a human. So I think brands really need to look at the humanity behind these athletes and what are they doing that's creative and interesting and not just climbing Everest, not just doing that big peak.
Welcome to the Backcountry Marketing Podcast. My name is Cole Heilborn. Today, I'm sitting down with Lindsay Rogers, founder of Raw Strategy. Raw Strategy works with high-level athletes and leaders throughout the outdoor industry to work on positioning and messaging. They also work with the Olympic and Paralympic teams, as well as some of the North Face athletes on positioning. Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. I love this idea of positioning and messaging for athletes. I don't feel like this is something that I've ever really considered. Positioning is a big topic in the business agency creative world, but how cool is it that you get to do this with athletes?
I do feel kind of lucky. Yeah. I mean, it was interesting because I was an athlete for a long time, and then I left to become a freelance writer and then work on the brand side. And I did start to notice that there were all these athletes in all sorts of different parts of the outdoor industry who were working with brands. But none of us and none of them really knew how to kind of talk about yourself, what to talk about in terms of your own personal story. And then if you had a message, what was it? How do you talk about it? How do you communicate it? How do you align it with the brands that you're supposed to be paid from, et cetera? So that's why I kind of created that initial program called the Raw Athlete, is to help give those athletes what they need to actually be prepared to communicate their value to those brands and connect to the brands in that way. So it's not a skill set that I think you're supposed to have as an athlete, right? You're sort of focused more on doing what you do well. So we found that a lot of brands are really excited about the fact that we're coming in and saying, hey, we're going to give them this skill, and it's also going to help you. It's going to benefit you as a brand. So yeah, it's been exciting. And I love working with athletes because it's, their job is so personal to them. It's what they're ultimately passionate about. And that's what I absolutely love.
So today we're going to be talking about athletes and ambassadors and just some of the changes and trends that are happening in the industry. You've obviously got a front row seat to a lot of this. And I think, we hear rumors about athlete teams changing, things evolving. It seems like programs are really being put through the ringer in some cases. And I'm excited to kind of sit down with you and dissect what our athlete programs look like today. What makes a successful team, and how can brands better equip their teams to be better athletes and advocate for brands. I'd love if you could kind of give us an opening statement. I guess, why is this a topic that you're passionate about?
Oh gosh, that is a big question. So I think first of all, it does come down to me being an athlete. I was an athlete. I struggled with these same things, but I didn't really know what I needed at the time. And I don't think a lot of athletes know that this is a skill set that they can get better at, that also can become a huge asset, not only in their career, but also as they go to hang up their skis or their climbing rope or whatever. We really wanted to give these athletes something that they could develop over time, but then paid significant dividends later in life as well, because we want to give them something that is sort of independent of the platforms and independent of the brands, because there's some crazy statistics out there about the mental health of athletes as they, close in on the end of their career because they have no other skill set. So part of what we're doing is equipping those athletes also for when their career sort of starts to come to an end. And I think partly, again, I'm passionate about it because I've been there. I have tons of friends who have been on myriad of national teams, and they all hit this point. So I think I'm personally invested in it because of the community that I'm in and where I was in the past. So I think that's why I care. It's something that's so fixable too. It's not something where it's like, oh darn, they're out of luck. Like, too bad there's no solution. There are really easy solutions to help them. So that's what we're aiming at.
And how do you define the problem? What is the problem that you're trying to solve?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say there's a couple different things going on. One is that athletes, they are so focused on, like what we said a few minutes ago, they're so focused on what they're good at, right? They're so focused on being that elite athlete at the top of their game, trying to be better than anyone else. But that also leaves a little bit of a trail, right? Like they are gone a lot. So relationships have a tendency to suffer. They can't make a lot of money because despite what everyone thinks out there, where everyone's a high paid NFL athlete, they're not. There's some, again, statistics out there that's like 95% of professional athletes actually don't make enough to live. So they have to go on these crazy expeditions to raise money. Expeditions meaning they're going to go raise money from friends and family, and they live on less than 40 grand a year, and they do crowdfunding and all this stuff. So it's one of those things that the problem persists both within the athlete realm, but it also, what we're seeing is that those brands don't have the internal resources and the skill sets to actually give these athletes what they need. So it's kind of a two-pronged problem. And then you have people like, there's great sports agents out there, but the agent world is sort of known for its kind of scalping of athletes' revenue, right? So there's all these kind of bits and pieces that are taking from the athletes, but we're not giving them and investing in their future as what skill sets are we going to give them so that they can have longevity in their career and beyond their sporting career. So that intersection, that delta of athletes having, a primary focus on sport, not having a primary focus on finance and the other skills, and these brands also not having those internal resources to develop those skills, that's where the problem lies. There's no one coming in and saying, hey, we're going to develop these athletes in this way.
On the outside, I would assume, folks might assume that, hey, these people get paid to have a logo on their shoulder or on their helmet, and they travel around the world and they make 6 or 7 figures, but that doesn't sound like the reality.
It's not the reality. I think there's so many assumptions with athletes. I mean, you had mentioned this, but I work with the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and those athletes are some of the poorest. They make hardly any money, except for the top 2% of the athletes in that world who are garnering a lot of attention. They don't make a lot of money, and it really is, what happens is that it makes the case for these athletes having a very short career because they financially cannot sustain the career, even though their skill sets might be there, their athletic ability might be there. So I think it's a misconception that these athletes make a ton of money. I mean, there's the Jimmy Chins of the world. There's those people who, yes, they're the top of their game. They're also making money from other sources. So not just making money from climbing, they're making money from speaking gigs and, movies and all the things. So that's the other thing, is we looking at these athletes as these one-dimensional characters where we just need them to speak to the brand versus also equipping them as business people. Like they have to be thoughtful about building a sustainable business as an athlete. So those are kind of the skills that we're trying to give them.
So I'm curious if you could back up a little bit and provide a little context to your role as an athlete. And you mentioned that athletes are often perceived as one-dimensional people. Did you realize that about yourself at some point in your career of being an athlete?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just revisiting this myself, thinking about this recently, how when I was an athlete, I think there were a few things going on. One is that, and this, I hear this from every single athlete I work with, they say, I don't want to be seen as just an athlete. Like I'm more than that, right? And I think I hit that too, where I had all these interests in other things that I wanted to do. I wanted to write, I wanted to be a freelancer, all these things. But you kind of get pigeonholed as you can't do both. You're supposed to be good at this one thing, stay in your lane. And so it's really hard for athletes to be sort of multidimensional and break outside of that stay in your lane box. And it's shifting. Like I feel like in the last year, this has changed pretty dramatically, and we can get into this. This is very representative of why athlete rosters are changing really dramatically. But I do think for a long time, you were supposed to just be an athlete. And there's people like Caroline Gleip, like she just announced that she is running for Senate. She's getting a lot of pushback. I'm a huge supporter of her doing this and young people being multidimensional and doing other things besides just their sport. But she is getting a lot of flack. And so I think there's still this hang up of athletes, stay in your lane, do your thing, head down, just do that. We only want you to inspire us with your physical ability, we don't want to see you as something else. So
Hey.
I think what happens is that singular identity can be the kind of mental death of athletes because they don't see themselves as anything else. If they do start to lean on other parts of themselves, it starts to become really chaotic. Like, they start to ask themselves, like, who am I? And so
Hey.
other people start not understanding who they are, what they represent. So there's a mental health component to that. Absolutely.
Yeah, no kidding. So tell us a little bit about your athlete career. What did that look like? What were you a part of?
Yeah, so I grew up in Aspen, Colorado, and I grew up ski racing. So I ski raced through NORAM and then a couple of Europa Cups over in Europe. And so I was on, I think they organized the US ski team a little bit differently now, but they had sort of this development team of the US ski team. So that's the point I got. And then I had a pretty huge injury that I'll spare you the details, but it was a pretty kind of career-ending injury. Kind of had lots of fractures up and down both my legs, and so it was really hard to recover from. And I was just a speed skier, so mostly Super G and downhill. And so when I went to college, they only focus on tech events, GS and slalom, and so that's kind of when I started to hang them up. And then after I left college, I opened the door again and started doing more kind of big mountain skiing, did a few of the competitions, but then started doing more kind of expedition skiing. So traveling all over the world, try to climb and ski big peaks. And that's when I started working with several different brands again. Growing up ski racing, I had the sponsors, but it was very, very siloed in ski racing. There was no personal brand back then. And so when I started doing more of that expedition style skiing, I started working with Mountain Hardwear and all the ski companies and brands and K2. And so it was interesting. And it was also one of those experiences where it left me with a lot of questions. Like, what do you want me to be doing? What am I supposed to be doing? Am I supposed to be talking about you out there? How do you want me to be talking about you out there? So I felt sort of this wash of confusion. Like, I didn't really get any really clean answers from anyone or any directives. And I think that's the case with a lot of athletes. They sort of feel like, well, I know I'm sponsored by you, but what do you want out of me? And how am I supposed to do that? Like, you're expecting these things from me, but I don't really know how I'm supposed to do it. So that's what I experienced as well.
Yeah.
So I started kind of foraying my athletic endeavors into writing as well. So I would pick expeditions where I could write feature articles for magazines. So I started working a lot with Outside and National Geographic and all the other ones in between. And so that started taking a little bit more precedence for me, is working in terms of what I could get a story out of versus kind of what's the big thing I could go ski. So I started working heavily in that genre of kind of writing more and more. And then I also went to what the industry calls the dark side and started working more with brands also, because it was the time when that kind of narrative side was starting to embed itself into the marketing mechanisms, and a lot of brands were hiring writers. And so I started working a lot with brands on how do you integrate kind of that narrative infrastructure into your marketing messages. And that's when things shifted pretty dramatically.
If you had to describe a perfect relationship between a brand and an athlete, what does an ideal state look like?
Okay, I would say it's funny. There's a few different brands who are doing pieces of this really well, and I won't name them quite yet. But what I would say is a brand needs to look at an athlete as a holistic vehicle. So a holistic brand, not just their athletic endeavors, not just the things that they're interested outside of their athletics, but as a whole, the characteristics, the values, what they've been through, what they can talk about. And then also go in and say, hey, these are our brand values, and how do you connect with our brand values? And then really set the stage for, we have all these different athletes as part of our roster, and you have this really solid message. Why don't you focus on that? This other person has this other solid focus for their messaging. You focus on that. And also look at the intersections of those athletes. Like, how are those relationships being developed between athletes? Because people are very fascinated in that, with how the athletes interact with each other and how they do the things that they do on their own, because a lot of these athletes are very independent and training on their own. So for brands, I would say really look at a holistic person, not just their physical abilities. And then also look at how can that person connect with their core consumer or even beyond their core consumer? Like, what are those things that are interesting as a human? Because ultimately there's a lot of studies being done on kind of how people react to not just athletes, but how people react to messaging. And there's two things that we as humans are really, really react well to. One is creativity and one is humanity. And I think in the past, 15, 20 years, the humanity of the athletes has sort of been pulled out a little bit in lieu of focusing on their athletic achievements. This is the Red Bull model of, we're going to bring you in, we're going to wash you off, clean you up, and we're only going to put you on the roster if you are podiuming over and over again. As soon as you stop performing, you're out. So I feel like that model is slowly being retired because it's really hard to connect to as a human. So I think brands really need to look at the humanity behind these athletes and what are they doing that's creative and interesting and not just climbing Everest, not just doing that big peak.
This is really fascinating because this is something I've been thinking about, and I'd love to bounce this idea off of you.
Mm-hmm.
So I see this often. I feel like brands will go out and produce a film about an athlete or an ambassador. And maybe I'm seeing this because we're still kind of in the middle of this transition, but it seems like there's a lot of content that gets created that's purely focused on the physical. It's purely focused on peak bagging. It's focused on, the FKT or whatever. And those are impressive, no doubt. But as you said, it's hard for the general population to relate with that athlete because we don't know what it's like to summit Everest. But what we do know, what we can relate on is the humanity level. We can relate on those values. And so I feel like there's this massive opportunity to either find athletes who have more of those humanity stories or emphasize the humanity of the athletes on teams. But is that something that you see? Like, are we kind of in this middle ground where we're still focused on the physical, but we're also focused on the humanity and we haven't totally blended those two worlds?
I think we are right in the middle of a transition, right in the middle. And I think last year was a really interesting year. I mean, there was so much going on last year in sports, and I'll just name a few trends and then I'll get back to kind of your question. But one is that we were looking at athletes are now really, really becoming the face of those sports teams, leagues, et cetera, more than they ever have been. Women, obviously, the women in sports became a huge trend last year, and brands are really starting to kind of shift their focus into the holistic female athlete. So they're looking at training female coaches, like how are we elevating coaches into kind of new realms of, the professional sports world. Barbie came out, all those things that are kind of supporting the female athlete. Then we have, obviously there's all these shows on streaming platforms, right? So there's this almost like a democratization of sports. And I think that's trickling down into the rosters, right? Where you're looking at how brands are really taking that, for lack of a better term, kind of citizenry of the people who they want to connect with, of their consumers, and infiltrating it into their brand or their athlete rosters. And so what that looks like is like the North Face, for example. Last year, I've worked with them for a while with all of their different athletes, and they had something called, I think it was called the Athlete Development Program, where they put out this kind of call for pitches and applications for everyday athletes out there in the world. And it was really, I think, a statement on, hey, we're not just looking for the Everest climbers or the Jimmy Chens of the world. And those are great. They kind of have to have those as the top of the pyramid. But we're also looking at how are we, bringing in this idea of, different races, different cultural backgrounds. A lot of the DEI is kind of starting to come into this fold in this conversation around who are these people and how are people connecting to them? Because brands see that if they focus on one type of athlete, they're going to get one type of consumer because they are the face of the brand. So if you look at that as like that spreading out or kind of democratization of those athlete rosters, I think it allows people to connect more deeply emotionally with those athletes if they have these different tiers. And I know you and I talked about this really briefly, but last year, Eddie Bauer kind of made this big splash because they literally overnight like fired their entire athlete team. And I think some of them had a hint that it was coming, but they did it. They kind of fired their high level athlete team, but then they kind of rehired a bunch of people that were more like a highly varied group of photographers and fishermen and adventurers, because they did want to spread that across like a wider spectrum of people so people could connect more deeply with who they were and they could see themselves in those athletes. Because as you just said, sometimes it's really hard to connect with people who are climbing Meru or Everest. I'm not going to do that. Most people are not going to do that. But I will connect with someone who's going on a 5-hour mountain bike ride or pushing themselves at a particular event. So really understanding what those human elements of those people are, those everyday people, and highlighting those kind of that humanity behind those people, I think is really where it's going.
Sounds like the industry is filling out the pyramid of athletes.
I think so. Yeah. But I also think what's interesting too is, you can look at the outdoor industry, but if you look across just sports in general, like, more traditional sports, there's really interesting things happening as well where like there's creative directors are being hired by teams. So never before has like a hockey team had like a creative director. So it's not the brand that's hiring the creative director, but it's actually like these teams, because they are seeing that like culturally people are really interested in athletes being these everyday people who are, wearing clothes and going to the grocery store. So, they're like us. So yeah, I think there's that natural evolution towards back towards how do we connect as human beings, on a very basic level.
And that's what I see the opportunity in storytelling. It's like if you can take someone who has an incredible physical accomplishment, like summiting Everest, but then you build in those scenes or those moments where they are going to the grocery store or they are paying their taxes or paying their rent. Like I feel like those are the moments where you get to relate with someone and you get to realize it takes them off the pedestal. And they're like, oh, they are just a regular person. Sure, they're doing this crazy expedition, but they're very much like me. And I feel like that's something I would love to see more of, specifically in documentaries and films, in the ability to relate with an audience.
Yeah, I think not to pick on companies like TGR, but sorry, TGR, I'm going to pick on you for a second. So when I go to those films, and I grew up seeing Warren Miller, right? Well, the Warren Miller films, and you have all the bloopers, and it's really funny. And what I think TGR has missed, unfortunately, and I think there's the other companies like them have missed, is that people walk away, the kids walk away, the adults walk away wondering, who are those people? All you know is how big they went. You have no idea who these people are. You have no idea where they grew up, what their hardship was, what they went through, what they've learned, how they have become who they are. And ultimately, that's what people care about, because again, it's like a disconnect between what they're doing and what I'm going to be able to do. But there's also this universality of the struggle, the hardship, the pain, all of those things that we all go through as human beings living in the world, that I think companies like TGR, brands can really leverage what these athletes have been through. Because like one of the big things that we talk to athletes about is this, and leaders, actually, this is like very, very important for them as well, is this idea of, you want to connect on this like shared identity, right? I am this, you are this, we are both this thing. So if you can say we are both this thing, it really builds this kind of intimacy and trust between you and them. So there's less of that tension between you and them and more of that connection. But then the other piece that I don't see very often, and this is where we really do a lot of our work, is really figuring out, what have you been through? What has it caused in you? What reaction has it caused in you? How have you righted this ship, changed your process? What have you done because of that hardship? Like when your back was up against a wall, you had to make a decision. And then how has it changed what you do today? And then the key thing that I feel like we're really trying to hone in on is how does that impact other people? How does that impact other people? Because athletes are so focused on the lens being on them that as soon as they start to shift over to how what I've been through can impact other people, the brand wins, they connect way deeper with audiences, et cetera. So that piece is a really, really key piece of how we start to coach athletes is how do you shift your experience into something that other people can benefit from? And as soon as brands start thinking that way too, all of a sudden they have influencers that go far, far deeper than selling clothes, than selling gear. They have these people that are deeply connected to their audience. So that's my mission. I want people to share that stuff.
Why do you feel like that is? Why do you feel like those aren't things that are typically shared or are flushed out?
I think it's hard. I think it's harder. It's a lot harder than saying I went to the grocery store. It's a lot harder than saying like I have this dog who cuddles up with me on the couch, or I trained 10 hours, lapping the like ice fall in Uray. Like it's harder to figure out, and you need someone sort of like an outside source helping you and asking you really hard questions and then saying, hey, this is an opportunity, and really pointing out the patterns and connecting those dots with you. Is it's like, I'm a big fan of therapy. I think everyone on the planet should, go to a therapist, because what they do is they can help connect the dots for you, right? Like oftentimes we just need someone else to do it for us and help us. And so I think it's partly that. It's just not a vernacular that these athletes or brands have really been taught. But I think to compete today in the world on that human level, you have to go there, or else that kind of vulnerability and intimacy is just not going to come.
So you mentioned that athletes historically are typically one-dimensional. Do you feel like if athletes can start to answer this question or kind of round out this part of their life, it will make them multi-dimensional?
I'm gonna shift what you said just a tiny bit. I think they are multi-dimensional. I think other people see them as one-dimensional, and they absolutely hate it. I'm not kidding when I say every single athlete, and I give them a huge list of questions before we start working together. I say, what is the biggest challenge you have? And they say, being seen as just an athlete. And so I think they all have these multi-dimensions. They're afraid to share them because I think they're really afraid that their audience is going to look at them and say, "What? I'm not into this side of you. I only like that side," which can happen. To be fair, that can happen. It's a risk. But I also think younger generations in particular I'm sure you've seen these studies too. They're very, very focused on what a brand stands for and what a person stands for. And they will get behind you if they know that. If they don't know what you stand for, they're not going to have staying power as a supporter of you. And so I think these athletes have to do the work to figure out, what are those dimensions? How do I want to be perceived? How am I showing up? What am I saying that really ladders up to that idea of who I want to be perceived as? And sometimes it requires, we have this kind of 3-step process that we talk about where it's sort of this unbrand, rebrand, and re-educate. And the unbranding piece oftentimes is like these athletes get to a point in their career when they're like, well, but I'm seen as this thing. I've always been seen as this thing. How do I distance myself from that one thing? So we have to go through this unbranding process, then decide, okay, well, how do you want to be seen? How do you want to be perceived? What do you want people to know about you that's going to change that perception? And then we go into the re-education piece. That's like, okay, this is what we're going to start to put out there to kind of re-educate this audience on who you are, why you're meaningful, why you're going to have impact on their life. So it's a process, but I think for them, it really opens up this sense of relief of I'm not just that one thing. I don't have to just be that thing. Thank you. So it's really cool to see them connect the dots too of oh my God, it's like a pressure valve release. It's so neat to see.
Is that possible with the way that most brands work with athletes today? Are brands equipping athletes to encourage them to, round themselves out and figure out who they are and who are they beyond, just the podium? Is that doable in today's world?
Absolutely doable. I almost think it's a must do to be able to kind of compete at that level. And I think the beauty of all of this focus on mental health with athletes is that they are shining a light on, we do need to round out these athletes. We can't just put them in this pressure cooker and expect them to be everything we want them to be, but we need to kind of round them out. And so absolutely, I think it's 100% possible. I think brands are more and more open to it. And I think they're seeing success of other athletes and other brands doing this very well. And I think, there's people that I could point to. I mean, one, just because I've worked with her, Hillary Nelson, unfortunately, she passed. She was really starting to do this a lot and really starting to kind of open up that vulnerability door. And people were looking at her as, kind of this person that's piercing this veil. Like, finally, you're talking about these things that no one has elevated before. And now I get you more. Now I can connect with you more. Now I see why you do these things. Whereas before, she may have been judged for being a mom on an expedition. When she explained why and what drove her, people started to get it and support her a lot more. So I think when brands see those success stories, or brands kind of take a risk in elevating those elements of the athletes, and they see how well it resonates, then they're more willing to do it over and over again. And so I think it's shifting from brands seeing it as a risk to brands seeing it as like a must have. And they're figuring it out, right? Hopefully they'll, bring, whether it's me or someone else, in to like really help do this in a thoughtful way, because you don't want to do this willy-nilly, because I think you can do it very inauthentically and it have the opposite effect. So I think you want to be thoughtful, slow, smart, and really elevate the stories that are deeply meaningful to the athletes, but then also deeply meaningful to the audience.
Do you feel like audiences are inspired differently today than they were, say, 20 years ago?
Yes. But it's interesting. I think they are inspired differently. Actually, I don't know if I would say inspired differently. I would say their expectations have shifted. I think if you look back across humanity in general, and there's all sorts of, again, not to point to studies, but there's all sorts of studies being done on this right now, where from a psychological perspective, people really want a few different things. They want a sense of meaning in their life. They want a sense of belonging. Like, I belong to this type of group that I connect with, or that I have similar functions in. And then there's this idea of psychological richness. And this is something that's kind of come up more and more recently, where people want to experience something that makes their life more rich, more interesting, more kind of challenged. And I think that's a shift that may have happened from a brand and athlete perspective, is that people are still inspired by those kind of deep human stories that Johnson & Johnson does at the Olympics, for example. But I don't think what they're inspired by has changed, but I think their expectation around wanting to be kind of enriched by these stories has shifted. They're not just looking to be inspired. They also want to have that aspirational, that could be me. I understand them. Maybe I could do that. So that has shifted a little bit, I think.
Interesting. I never considered the difference between inspired and enriched, and where that line is. But it sounds like you're saying if you can enrich someone, maybe another word for that is empowered. You help them see a potential path they could take. Where I feel like inspired is just like you kind of walk away with your mind blown and you're like, oh my gosh. But there's no way for me as a viewer to feel like I could follow those same steps. Is that kind of what you're saying?
A little bit, yeah. And I think there's this other element when we talk about that enriched. It's also this idea of shifting perspective. So it's not just I get to see the potential of what I could be because you're showing me a way, but it's also this idea of, wow, I've never thought about it that way. That's so interesting. Now I have this different view of it, and I'm going to come back to you for more because that was really cool. I've never heard someone say that before. So that type of enrichment where you're just literally giving people this slight shift in perception and perspective that they didn't have before. And that's a big one, what we kind of coach athletes on, and a lot with leaders, is that how do you shift someone's perspective? Because ultimately, if you do that, they start to pay attention because our brains say, oh, that's new. I got to come back. That's new. I learned something there. So I think it's more than how can I also do that thing. It's about saying, wow, I learned something there that I never imagined to be true. And that's enriching.
It's 2024 and we're in this crazy world of digital marketing, and there's the attention span economy is, there's tons of studies out there, but it's short and it's only getting shorter. It feels like this need that humans have to feel enriched could be at odds with the way that we're consuming and engaging with media. But I almost feel like that creates more of a need for enrichment in our lives. But how do you, as an athlete, how do you break through that if the way that you're interacting with people is changing? How do you see those two pieces playing and evolving?
Yeah, I don't disagree with you that they can be seen as at odds with each other. Absolutely. Because not to drop numbers, but I think people say, but you have between 3 and 7 seconds to grab someone's attention, right? So if you're looking at, social media, for example, and you have between 3 and 7 seconds to snag someone on a story, then what we do is we say, how do you shift their perception or perspective right up front to give you the ability and that flexibility to kind of drag them along a little further? Because if you do grab them right up front, it gives you more flexibility, more leeway to shift their perspective or do more, tell more story later. And there's also, there's trends heading in the opposite direction also. So there's, like your podcast isn't 7 minutes, right? You have Rich Roll, you have Tim Ferriss, they have 2, 3, 4-hour podcasts that people are wanting a little bit more deeper information versus this very little information across a lot of different topics. People are starting to realize that, wow, I don't really know much about a lot, but I want to know more about fewer topics. And so that trend is going in a couple of different directions. And so what we always like kind of slow growth over fast growth. I'm not one to focus on kind of the viral nature of what you're going to put out there, because that has absolutely no sustainability whatsoever. So we focus very much on what's meaningful to you. How do you build an audience that is going to stick with you and that believes very truly in who you are and what you're doing, versus that quick, like one-off story that's going to grab headlines. And it can be helpful briefly, but oftentimes the gold medal can be what people are interested in 6 months. Or the fact that you tagged that peak, people aren't going to be interested in that in 6 months, but they will really remember how you feel, right? And this is marketing 101, but data and facts do not leave people with, it doesn't evoke emotion. And so when we try to grab someone in that kind of 3 to 7 seconds, and then we kind of build upon that and allow people to kind of feel something because it hits them and connects with the universality of their emotions, then it gives people more flexibility in how much time they can spend with their audience. So that was a long-winded way of saying it is a challenge, and I think it'll continue to be a challenge, but I think there's a swing slightly away from short, quick virality stuff and going more towards meaning.
Yeah, people aren't afraid to go deep if it's a medium and a person that they trust. That seems like massive opportunity for an athlete. I think about like Payson with his podcast, the Adventure Stash podcast. What a great example of an athlete who's taken his position as an athlete and then gone super, super deep and gone in a direction not many other athletes have gone before.
I agree. And again, it's that example, it's Caroline Gleick, it's all these people who have taken their platform and used it for something that is beyond the scope of athleticism. And so I think it's a real door opener for them. And again, like we were talking about, these athletes will not be at the top of their physical game for long, right? And so how do you give them the tools that they can use, and how do you get them to think outside the box to do something beyond the summit so that they can have a career and something to lean on when they do leave that sport or when they kind of retire from the professional level? So I think there's endless opportunities and examples out there of people doing that. And it takes courage, absolutely, because I think it does require them separating themselves slightly from just being an athlete. So, yeah.
Whose responsibility is that? Is that the brand's responsibility to initiate this, or how do you see that playing out?
People might disagree with me on this, and I'm completely okay with that. So I do feel like the brands are leveraging these athletes as their kind of front door into their marketing, right? Like this is how we're getting people interested in us, is by using these athletes and what they're doing. So if the brand is using the athletes to that degree, it's my belief that it is their responsibility to tool up these athletes and skill up these athletes with exactly what they need to reflect well on the brand. I mean, why wouldn't you do that? It seems like an obvious win-win, where you give athletes this skill and this tool, and then it reflects really well on the brand. That has a longer sustainable relationship versus these athletes kind of peeling off really quickly. So it is my belief that it's on behalf of the brand to give these athletes that initial nudge and that initial support to say, we don't want you here just because of your podium, just because of your summit, just because of those things. We want you here for a long period of time. Here's what it's going to take on our end, and really giving them those resources and that support, and not doing the kind of Red Bull method of like cutting them as soon as they're off the podium. So I think that can have pretty drastic effects on these athletes and their mental health. So I think it's incumbent on the brand to start that process. And I think it's also incumbent on the athletes to ask the brands, hey, I need this support. It's, there's all sorts of studies on kind of rising leaders in the corporate world on how they're asking of their corporate environment. They want much more support kind of on the learning and development, personal growth, professional growth side. And I think that is going to start to have a trickle down, or want it to have a trickle down effect in the athlete side, because I think they need to keep asking for it. And the more they ask for it, the more the brands are going to respond. So I think it's two. I think, inevitably these two, it's a relationship. They have to trust each other. They have to give each other something. So the athletes oftentimes don't really know like what they need to give back to the brand. So that's where I do feel like it's incumbent on the brand to say, hey, this is what we need. Here's how you're going to do it. Ask any questions. What else do you need from us? Because we're going to lean on you heavily to bring the consumers in.
Do you feel like brands are under-equipped or understaffed? Is this why there's maybe a gap between the potential that an athlete team could be and what it is?
Oh, 100%. And it's not just brands either. It's like when you look at, again, kind of more the broader sport world, it's teams, leagues, national governing bodies. They're under-equipped, but they're not supposed to have to do that. They haven't historically really needed to equip athletes on this level. But I think because consumers are asking for more depth, they're asking for humanity, they're asking for that creativity, it's becoming a requirement to compete. And so I think some brands, I'm not going to say all brands, because that's insane. Some brands do this very, very well. And I think they're realizing, hey, we do need this as just part of the regular run of business. But I don't think it's everywhere in the outdoor industry, partly because people are in the outdoor industry because they love it. It's passionate. It's not some massive money-making scheme in the outdoor industry typically. So I think resources are a little bit tighter when it comes to brands. And so I think, there's also a great consulting culture out there now where, brands are hiring consultants, freelancers to come in and help with these things. And I think that's great. And I think they should not necessarily feel like they need someone full-time to do this, but I do think they also need to equip their internal staff to say, hey, we need to start elevating that humanity. How are we going to do that? What's our program? So if they can give their internal teams that language, that vernacular to start to kind of broaden what they're doing, great. I don't think they have to have those internal resources. They can easily get them outside.
What are some other roadblocks that you see or you foresee that will get in the way of athlete rosters reaching their full potential? I mean, anything from the brand side, from the athlete side, external forces.
George.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there is a level of vulnerability and kind of courage it takes on behalf of both the brand and the athlete to do what I am suggesting, because it's not the easiest path. It's a little bit of a harder path, but a more meaningful path. So I would say there is a little bit of resistance sometimes with athletes to say, this feels very exposed. I feel like I'm exposing some pieces of me that I'm not comfortable with. So like younger athletes, it's a little bit of a harder push to get there. Older athletes are like, all day long, bring it. I love this stuff. So I think there is that piece though, where, there can be some resistance on behalf of the athletes to say, wow, this is a new way. This is a new way of doing things. And, anytime you introduce something new, there's a little bit of pushback. So I think that's one. I would say, resources always. So not necessarily resources internally at a company, but just financial resources to kind of bring in the right level of, professionals to help educate these athletes and the brands on what needs to be done. I think, we've seen COVID do really interesting things to the outdoor industry where it kind of spiked it, flattened at the beginning, then it spiked it, and now it's kind of leveling off. And so what's happening is that obviously the first thing to go with any company is their marketing budget. And typically the athlete world falls within the marketing budget. And so, there's the ebbs and flows, in the reality of that world. And so I think that can always be a challenge, but I also see this as, you talk to a lot of people about marketing, obviously, and I think as soon as you cut that, you also cut your connection with consumers. And so, I think that can always be a challenge, the ebb and flow of, the resources. But I do think as soon as they get into more of a cycle of producing content and producing these stories that do elevate the humanity, they'll see returns in a bigger way. So it's harder to use that excuse.
What's your take on, you mentioned elevating humanity, which I love. That's a neat phrase. What's your take on the industry's, how the rosters have been changing? As we were talking about filling out the pyramid, some brands are cutting off the top, so to speak. As we're adding more and more people to rosters, and we're adding more and more people who maybe aren't, at the very top of the physical game.
Okay.
What challenges, but what opportunities does that present? How do you see that playing out? Because I guess I talk to some brands and I talk to some athletes, and they see that as a concern. It's like, oh, are all people who are peak bagging going to be no longer have a job anymore? But obviously there's a balance to it all. But how do you see that? And I guess what's a healthy model look like?
I think there's going to have to be a little bit of a combination of the peak baggers, the high level athletes who are doing things that no one has done before, because I think that is exciting. It's very exciting to watch. It's very exciting to participate in. There's no denying that. I think just who we are, again, as human beings, we like to get behind people who are trying to do something we didn't think was physically or emotionally possible. So I think we'll always have that level of the pyramid. And I hope we do. It's exciting to me to think about people pushing the envelope on any number of sports. It could be traditional sports, could be climbing, mountaineering, whatever it is. So I think that's okay. We absolutely have to have that element. What I would love to see is that we're not just saying, so-and-so climbed the, 22,000 foot north wall in the Khumbu or something. We're talking about that not being the primary focus, or not being the only focus. We're talking about the depth of what it took to get there. What sacrifice they have to make, what's happening with the people at home, the fear, all of those kind of real things. And so I would say, we'll continue to have that side of the athlete roster. I think filling it out with programs that are a little bit more broad in terms of kind of DEI, but also just how do you ask your consumers what they want? What are they interested in? What do they hope, dream, fear, aspire to? Take the answers to those questions and start to hire athletes that connect to those answers, that give people what they want to experience. Because there's going to be some of your consumers who don't want to be scared watching the alpinist. There's going to be people who sweat, thinking about someone climbing Meru or whatever it is. So we want to think about, are there people who are in your consumer base who want to experience something totally different? What is that? Do that research, ask those hard questions, ask those not demographic questions, but psychographic questions of your consumers, and then connect the rest of your athlete roster with that, with what those consumers want to feel, what they want to experience, who they want to become, all of that. Because if you're not asking those questions of your consumers, you're missing the mark big time with your athlete roster. So I think that's a huge opportunity for people and for brands, is to ask different questions, ask harder questions, and then connect their roster to that.
Yeah. Something that I've heard from previous guests and some of our clients is, they don't want to, by adding more people and kind of backfilling this pyramid, if that's the analogy we're using, they don't want to lose their core consumer. They don't want to lose the extreme small percentage of their population, of their customers, who are out doing those hardcore things. Is that a risk that you see as legitimate, or is that just I don't know, does that really matter?
I absolutely matters. I think and again, I think I don't think I'm going to be the person who's out there telling people to get rid of their high level roster, because I am one of those people who finds them endlessly fascinating with how on earth do they pull that off? I want to understand it deeply because I'm curious about people. And I think other people would put themselves in that category. So I think there's a risk to pulling an Eddie Bauer, where you're getting rid of everyone on that high level and just going after kind of the base of the pyramid. And not that either one is more or less important. I do think it's really smart to have both, because there's different people who want different things from you. And if you're a Yeti, it makes way more sense to have the fly fisherman and all of that, because you're not necessarily carrying a cooler to the top of Everest, right? So that makes sense. And I think that's where you have to really look at who your consumer base is, because you might not be the person or the brand who needs someone climbing at that level. And your base is moving more towards really wanting to connect deeply with the everyday experience and that becomes more of an ambassador program, right? So it's slightly less of an athlete roster, more of an ambassador program. So that's a shift too, is that I have seen that brands have athlete rosters and then they have an ambassador program. And those are two very different tiers. The ambassador program is the everyday people out in the world getting you excited about using that product in your everyday life. And then the athlete program is a little bit that higher tier. So I will not be in the camp that you should get rid of your higher tier athletes. I think you should have both, but also, again, build those rosters so they are deeply connected with what your consumer base is looking for, what they want to experience.
I love how you described it at the beginning of the show. You said, identify what your needs and what your communication objectives are, and then find the athletes either who exist on your team already or who find new athletes, and then just draw the connection between them. Mm-hmm. It's such a simple strategy, such a simple idea. Obviously, as everything we talk about is simple in idea, but much more difficult in practicality. But that's a really neat way to think about it.
Yeah, again, it's really interesting when we work with people. We have one of our sessions is strictly focused on audience. And the questions, we give them all these questions to ask their, potential or existing audience. And some of them are like, are you kidding me? You're going to make me ask these questions because they're quite personal. And it's things like, what do you want more of in your life? Do you want more time? Do you want more meaning? What do you want less of? What are you afraid of happening? Like some kind of deep questions. And I do feel like brands are, especially in the outdoor industry, they don't ask those questions very well or very frequently, and therefore they build athlete rosters, they build their communication strategy around assumptions that these consumers want to experience this particular thing without really asking deep, hard questions. So again, to your point, what you just described is asking those hard questions and then connecting them to the right person to kind of put those into action, right? You're connecting them to an athlete or an ambassador who lives out what your consumer says they want to experience. So yeah, it's a slightly inverse way of doing things, but one I suggest.
Those seem like basic questions to ask, and they seem like they would be highly productive and fruitful when you're considering, if we only have this much money to deploy, let's make sure it's a really good investment. Why do you feel like those questions aren't being asked?
I've been a part of several focus groups for outdoor brands, and often it is very focused on product, right? Like, do you like this product? Does it feel good on your skin? Can it get you out running in the cold? And does it keep you warm and dry? So for brands in the outdoor industry, it's heavily, heavily focused on that physical experience. And I think there's other brands that are doing the, outside of the outdoor industry. Like I always give examples to both athletes and leaders who we work with, examples outside of the outdoor industry, because they do it very differently oftentimes. And they're not so focused on, it's very specific to the outdoor industry that you're focused on the physical experience of these products. And so, I would say that we encourage brands in the outdoor industry to ask these more emotional focused questions, because it is not only does it help you understand your consumers in a very different way, but it also helps the consumer see you as someone like, wow, that brand is asking me that question. They're bringing me into this conversation on that level. They must really care about me. So it's that idea of, you're going to get a lot out of it by asking these questions of these potential consumers, but they're also going to see you in a completely different way because you're asking them that. So, I don't know. I think it for historically probably has felt a lot like too soft or potentially too risky to ask those questions. And why would we need that when all we need to know if it's warm and waterproof? And now we're getting into an era where it's like, no, people have to actually believe in you as a brand before they even purchase a product. So,
well, because everyone, I mean, all the brands are making great products. Like everyone is making something that's outstanding and is warm and waterproof. So if we're all competing at the same level or similar levels, like what else? How do you go further? How do you go beyond? To your point.
Completely agree. Yep.
We haven't touched on this much, and this might be a can of worms. Pay and compensation for athletes is obviously a major piece of this equation. And as you said, many athletes can't sustain being a full-time athlete. Do you feel like there's a world where if some of these things can be sorted out, and we can develop rosters that are, more comprehensive and highlight individuals beyond their physical, like does pay follow? Is there a way to compensate athletes more if some of these other bigger issues are solved?
Yes, I think so. I want to believe yes, very much so. Just because I've seen some, pretty rough things happen to athletes unexpectedly, or if, a female athlete has a child, their pay is docked almost immediately, which, those kinds of things are a little bit rough. And so I do think there's a world in which the athlete roster is curated in a very thoughtful way, where maybe it's smaller. It might be less robust in terms of the breadth of the actual roster, but it's deeper in terms of who these people are, what they're doing for your brand, how much support they're getting on this kind of personal professional growth standpoint. And when you have a roster that sticks around for a little bit longer, it's less expensive for the brands as well. I mean, this again, I'm keep bringing up Red Bull because they have a very, very different model where they're very much like churning through athletes, but they're driven by their media house too. So that's a different model all the way around. But when you're looking at kind of traditional brands in the outdoor industry, I think there is a world in which they have fewer athletes, they support them more holistically, and they have a longer lifespan at the company. And that might mean there might be fewer athletes supported out there, but they're supported in a deeper, richer way. So yeah, I mean, I think financially, it's a question of, these athletes don't typically live a very expensive life, right? They're traveling a lot, and that typically gets paid for by the brands. They don't live, they're out doing their exciting thing with the equipment that they use, but they're not living like a very lavish New York City lifestyle or anything. So the pay, generally speaking, feels like it's quite low. It is in line with the lives that they live, but I think the athletes, it's also incumbent on them to say, here's what I need. And they have to know what their budget is. They have to, again, be like a smart enough, savvy enough business person to say to the brand, I need this to live. Here's my budget. You can look at it. Here's transparency into what my living expenses are. Here's the support I need from you to make it sustainable. And then also looking at, what are their other income sources, right? So I don't think it's fair for an athlete to lean 100% on one brand because it's unrealistic. And I think there's going to be a natural evolution of that athlete, evolving out of the sport eventually. So for the athlete, I think it's really smart to say, okay, how do I kind of diversify myself, my income streams, to say, maybe I'm, doing some speaking engagements in non-endemic places like Meta or Novartis or, somewhere where they are looking outside of the industry to kind of bring in some income. So again, I think there's responsibility on both parties. There's the brand to kind of pay them enough to be able to sustain a lifestyle, but it's also the athletes have to be realistic and say, I've got to diversify my income streams so I'm not holistically dependent on that one brand.
We've talked about a lot. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to mention?
Oh, gosh, we have covered a lot. And let's see. I think the only thing that I would say is that athletes have a huge opportunity right now because I think there's so much focus on sport in the mainstream. Again, like with all the trends we talked about a while ago in terms of, focus on women's sports and a lot of money being funneled into that world and, all these Breakpoint and Formula One, all these things coming out on Netflix. And so I think they have an opportunity right now to really say, I'm here in a bigger, deeper, richer way. I'm going to give you something more than just me climbing a mountain, and look at themselves as someone who is going to help someone else experience something new and exciting, and look at themselves as a business and how do I kind of elevate my business beyond the confines of sport? Because we have so many lights shining on sport right now and so many lights shining on athletes. The Olympics are about to happen, which always gets people very excited about athletes, no matter what sport you're in. And so I think it's a great time to be an athlete, and I think it's an exciting time to kind of broaden your perspective on what's possible.
Amazing. To send us home, what questions are you asking yourself these days? Are there any big questions that other than maybe what we discussed, is there anything that you are thinking about that you want to share with us that maybe you haven't quite figured out yet, or what keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? How to keep my kids healthy and happy? No, I would say, it's interesting. I mean, speaking of kids, I do think it's sort of interesting, me working in sport and with athletes and watching kids grow up and be involved in sports, and those who choose to be involved in sports and not involved in sports. It is really fascinating as a parent to watch the impact of these athletes on my kids. They're watching these Netflix series, they're getting so excited. And so I think when I work with these athletes, what I'm thinking of is like, do you have any idea who you're impacting right now? These people are watching you and you are going to impact decisions they make in their future, meaning my kids. And so, I think questions for me are just, how do I get these athletes to say yes to this stuff? Because it's so exciting for me personally. I love it. And I see the impact they can have. It's dramatic and it's huge and it's meaningful. So that's what I'll leave you with. Yeah.
I think one of the most special things about going to any sort of event, any sort of, bike or ski event is whenever there's an athlete signing and whenever the kids just flock the table and, they're decked out in the jersey number or whatever it is. And they're just so stoked to interact with that athlete, and just the chance to say hi and get an autograph and maybe get a picture means the world to them.
It means the world.
So when you consider what athletes are doing and when you consider what else we could be doing to help athletes, like, it seems like there's so many different ways we could do it. So it's encouraging to hear that you're out there spreading this message, trying to take a more holistic approach to athlete programs.
Yeah. No, thank you. I love it. I'm super excited. I love what I do, and I love the reaction we get from athletes. It's so fulfilling to me personally, and so cool to see these athletes all of a sudden open up this flower of like, wow, there's so much more I could be doing. There's so much more I could be experiencing and giving to other people. They'd never thought about themselves in that way, in a way where like, wow, I can really have like a very positive, dramatic impact on these people who are watching me, and they're watching me no matter what. So why don't I have this positive impact? As soon as they see themselves with that ability, oh man, it's like the lights go on. It's so cool.
Lindsay, if folks want to follow along with you, if they want to connect and ask you more questions, where can they find you?
Yeah, so the website is rawstrategy.net. Couldn't find the .com, or it's too expensive. And then on Instagram we're at Raw Strategy, and we're in the midst of a crazy launch with for Olympic and Paralympic athletes for a big program for the Olympics for Paris. So spread the word, everyone. But yeah, that's where you can find us.
Amazing. Well, Lindsay, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate you sharing. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye.